Hello, Timothy Noah.
Hello, Glenn Loury. I am Timothy Noah, a senior editor for The New Republic, writer of the TRB column, and author of, I am now, of course, holding up a copy of my book here, The Great Divergence.
Well, you both should hold up a copy.
That's right, great.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, make the pitch, Tim.
It's available at fine bookstores everywhere, and also electronically, if that's your idea of a good time. So, The Great Divergence in bookstores now. Okay.
Timothy Noah of The New Republic, it's an honor to have you on The Glenn Show. I'm Glenn Loury, Blogging Heads, and of Brown University Economics Department. And Tim, I got to tell you that we economists who do number crunching for a living haven't given as much attention to inequality, I think, as the subject deserves. And I'm awfully glad to have the prompting that comes from, critical journalistic engagement with these issues, such as what you're offering in your book, The Great Divergence. So thanks for coming on to do this. Tim, I'm wondering if we might just start the conversation with you telling us a bit about what you're arguing in the book. I mean, everybody knows that, the 99% and the 1% inequality is the issue du jour. But presumably you've got something, new to say about the subject, and I'm wondering what that might be.
Well, what I'm trying to do in this book is, sort of people have been talking about inequality, but I'm trying to, as rigorously as I can, and based on what, as best I can make out, is the consensus view among economists. Obviously, economists differ, but try and find a consensus among economists and also political scientists and sociologists. Where the answer to the question, where did this come from? How did we get this inequality trend, this 33-year trend? It began in 1979, continues today. Ever since 1979, we've seen income inequality expand. So just to be clear, obviously we had plenty of income inequality before 1979, but we have seen it expand since 1979. And I wanted to kind of take a systematic look at what the causes were. Also wanted to talk a little bit about why we should care about it, and finally to propose some solutions.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. So it seems to me we might start here with the facts, just a rough review of what has happened before and after 1979. I'd be very interested in hearing you parse the alternative causes that are bandied about in the literature as to why things have developed the way they have. And I certainly want to hear your thoughts about what the implications are of these developments. Solutions, I don't know. I hope that's not a bridge too far, but we have a lot of alternatives to choose from. So again, I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say. So why don't we start with the facts? I mean, what exactly has gone on in terms of trends in inequality, and why do you find it so alarming?
What's gone on is we've seen we had the status quo prior to 1979 was that the United States was a country where incomes were becoming steadily more equal. From about 1934 to 1979, incomes either were becoming more equal or they were stable. The relationship of the middle class to the wealthy was either unchanged, or you actually saw the middle class progressing a little faster in terms of income than the affluent. And economists just came to sort of accept this as a fact of modern industrial life. Simon Kuznets crafted a theory. He was a Nobel Prize-winning economist. Among his various accomplishments is he invented GDP. And he wrote a paper in the 50s where he said, look, what happens during during the period of industrialization, when an economy is going from agricultural to industrial, you're going to see a huge surge in income inequality. But then after that, after the transition has been made, you're going to see incomes become more equal. That's the mark of an advanced industrial economy. It wasn't true just in the United States. It was true in a number of Western European countries as well. He just said, this is the way life is. He might as well have said, he didn't quite say it, but the thrust of what he was saying was, this is the mark of an advanced civilization. We don't have incomes that are more unequal.
I remember learning about the Kuznets curve when I started studying economics in the 1970s. The so-called inverted U relationship between growth and inequality, just as you described it. And I remember being taught by my teachers at MIT in the early 70s that in the late stages of capitalist development, you could expect a pretty stable, year-to-year, decade-to-decade circumstance in which inequality didn't much change. And the record from World War II to when I was a student in the 70s had pretty much borne that out. Things changed quite a bit after that, did they not?
It changed in 1979, and for a few years economists were slow to kind of recognize this. They said, oh, this is some weird blip. This too shall pass, because we know that incomes become more equal in a society like ours. And of course, after a few years, they had to accept the fact that this was no longer an iron law of advanced industrial economies. Incomes became more unequal in the United States. They also became more unequal in a number of Western European countries, although not uniformly. Some countries remained about the same, for example, France. Some countries actually saw their incomes become more equal, like Turkey. I don't know, do we call Turkey a European country? Anyway, but nonetheless, it was a global trend. But the trend was much more pronounced in the United States. It was worse in the United States. The level of inequality was greater. The speed with which incomes were becoming more unequal was greater. So in my book, I try and look past the kind of global trends which are a given and say, why is it so much worse in the United States?
Okay, before you go on to that, let me ask you a question. And it's about these international comparisons of trends in inequality. It's gotten worse in the United States, and maybe it's gotten worse in Britain, but not as much worse as in the United States, and so on. Mm-hmm. The question I want to ask, and maybe it's gotten better in Scandinavia, I actually don't know the international comparative facts, but whatever they might be, the question is, these countries are not independent of one another, and might it not be the case that inequality can only get better in, say, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, because of the fact that it's getting worse, say, in the United States or Great Britain, and the fact that with international global trading relationships and so forth, the ability to tolerate a more egalitarian policy in the Scandinavian country is to some degree accommodated by the very fact of a more wide open and cowboy-like marketplace in the Anglo-American economies. Do you see the question I'm asking?
Yeah, no, I think it is true. Experiences tended to show that that less diverse cultures seem to find it easier to adapt more aggressively egalitarian policies when people are more like each other than not. They are more willing to embrace communitarian values
excuse me, it's not only that, it's also that to the extent that they desire to implement communitarian values through their policies, they're more able to do so because they can rely upon the less communitarian and perhaps therefore more energetic, more innovative, more productive societies and the fact of global trade to keep them afloat, notwithstanding that their tax rates might be high and their innovative business sector might be a little bit quieter because of their egalitarian policy.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite grasping the question.
Here's what I'm saying. I'm saying you got a big welfare state in Sweden. Mm-hmm. Big welfare states are great things, but they also have costs. Mm-hmm. Those costs are great in a society that doesn't trade with other societies that have smaller welfare states. And those costs may not be as great if they're able to trade freely with societies which are not as egalitarian because they are to some degree parasitic on the energetic and innovative character of these less egalitarian societies.
So you're saying that Sweden, because so much of its industry because it participates so in trade to a greater extent than the United States? Not really, right? I mean,
I'm sorry, I lost the audio there just a little bit, Tim, but I think you're restating. You were trying to restate what I was saying about Sweden.
Struggling to understand your point. Are you suggesting that Sweden trades more than the United States?
No. What I'm suggesting is that if you need innovation in the technical sector in order to bolster your productivity in manufacturing, the innovation can occur in North America, and you can still get the benefits of it in Scandinavia.
Oh, I see.
If in Scandinavia you're following policies that are deadening to innovation, you're more able to follow those policies without paying the economic costs, so long as other large trading economies are not following those policies, and you are able to get the spillover benefits of the innovativeness of those societies like the U.S. That's what I'm saying. Right. Which would make international comparisons tricky, because we wouldn't be holding everything constant. You see, that's my point.
You're kind of saying somebody has to be the big unequal powerhouse because they're going to generate innovation. The kind of sort of chaotic, let a thousand flowers bloom nature of American society produces innovation that more egalitarian nations can then grab a hold of and enjoy the benefit of.
That's what I'm saying, at least as a hypothesis. I don't know that it's true, but it's at least a possibility to be explored.
I guess my answer to that would be that the United States was certainly creating plenty of innovation between 1934 and 1979, when the trend was towards greater equality, as it also was in Europe. So I'm not sure that there's a direct relationship between the two.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it was just a thought. Anyway, you were about to talk some about what you thought and what other people think the causes of this great divergence that we're experiencing might be here in the United States.
Okay.
So what do you think is going on?
Well, I go through things that I think are the causes, and I also go through things that that are not the causes, that might be thought of as causes. So, for example, I immediately scratch off the list race and gender. The reason being, I am looking at the expansion of income inequality, and the income inequality between whites and blacks and between men and women have not gotten worse. Between men and women, they've gotten somewhat better. Between blacks and whites, they are essentially unchanged, which, full stop, is a terrible thing, and the subject of many other books that have been written and will continue to be written. But it's not the subject of my book, because I'm looking at the growth. And the growth cannot be driven by race-based income inequality, although certainly income inequality is no picnic for African Americans.
Can I just before you go on that point, observe that while the income gap between blacks and whites may not have much changed in recent decades, the politics of inequality could be influenced by race nonetheless.
That's right.
Right. So race could have an indirect effect on inequality. Not the fact that blacks are the ones who are, dragging the inequality numbers in the wrong direction, but the fact that we don't do as much about inequality as we otherwise might, because our politics are impacted in some way by racial considerations.
That's exactly right, and that's been pointed out to me since the book came out. It's a point I hadn't really thought about. That yes, to the extent that there are government. Our democracy is less hospitable to the notion of income redistribution than it used to be. Obviously, some of that does have to do with race. It has to do with the fallout of the civil rights era, the realignment of the South, and so on. Yes, I would agree, and the rise of the conservative working class white male. So yes, politically, race does play a role. But directly, it does not, and neither does gender. Immigration is another logical suspect, particularly since this all happened not too long after the 1965 immigration law, which vastly increased immigration in the United States, and in particular opened up a lot of immigration from Latin America. And strangely, though, immigration does not seem to have been a major contributor. As I cite George Borjas, who is a pretty conservative, not terribly pro-immigration economist at Harvard, and he, in looking at this question, concluded that the only population that's really affected by immigration over the last 30 years are high school dropouts, a fairly small group in the economy, and not really the target group that we're looking at when we're looking at income inequality, because the income inequality trend that is really pronounced over the last 30 years is not the relationship between the poor and the middle class, which actually hasn't changed all that much over the last 30 years. It was lousy to be poor 30 years ago. It's still lousy to be poor. But rather the relationship between the middle class and the affluent.
Now this is an interesting observation to me. Mostly when people think about immigration, they think it's bidding down the wage of low-skilled workers. Right? If I've got people coming in doing, farm labor or working in construction at relatively lower wages or whatever, the effect is going to be to keep wages low for the domestic workers who'd be working in that area. You're not denying that that's true. You're simply saying that the main inequality trend is not at the middle to the bottom of the income distribution. It's rather at the top relative to the middle, and immigration hasn't got much to do with that. I find that to be a very interesting observation.
Right, and construction is, of course, a gray area there, because construction jobs are union jobs, and therefore middle-skilled jobs, middle-income jobs potentially, and we have seen a lot of displacement of construction jobs by immigrants, non-union immigrants, but apparently not to the extent where it's made a huge difference. Another interesting thing here is that at this moment, when America is heatedly debating immigration policy, we may, and I emphasize may, we may be seeing this problem in the process of solving itself. Because immigration from Mexico has leveled off. I think it's even dropped a little bit in the last couple of years. Now, many people have said that's the recession, but we've had recessions over the last 20 years, and we didn't see a drop in those earlier recessions. There is some tentative evidence that part of what's happening is that the economy of Mexico has strengthened to the point where the incentive for Mexicans to cross the border into the United States has diminished. We learned, for example, I don't know if you knew before this week, certainly I didn't, that Walmart is the biggest employer in Mexico these days.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's incredible. And, our trade with Mexico is way, way up. Now, it seems that you can worry about the effects of low-wage, trade with Mexico, a low-wage country, which is something legitimate to worry about. Or you can worry about the effects of immigration, also something legitimate to worry about. But it's awkward to worry about them both at the same time. I don't say anything definitive, but there are people who believe that we are seeing what may be the start of a permanent downturn in immigration, illegal immigration from Mexico. The Pew folks have put out a report on this just this past week.
No, I saw that report, and I saw reports on the report. Net migration from Mexico is zero. People coming in just balanced by people flowing back in the other direction. You even got the problem now in Mexico of bilingual education, in that you've got young people coming back from the United States whose only language they speak well is English, with their parents to live in Mexico, and they have to be educated now as bilingual students in Mexico.
So the nativists should have been for bilingual education all along.
I gather people in Mexico City are trying to learn from California. How do you teach somebody who doesn't speak the language? So we live in interesting times. Okay, well, it's not immigration, you say. It's not race. It's not gender. What else is it not? What about the collapse of the family? What about the rotten state of our public education and so on?
Right.
Is that,
the rotten state of the family obviously has some impact. But again, not quite as much as you would think, because women are doing so well in this economy that single women are have performed pretty well in this economy. Working mothers, even single mothers, have done pretty well, so that they aren't that much of a drag on women's wages. Although obviously it is true that when you are a single parent is much likelier to end up in poverty than anybody else. So it's a factor, but it doesn't appear to be an enormous factor. We haven't discussed trade, which is an interesting sort of yes and no situation, where it really wasn't much of a factor for the first 2/3 of the Great Divergence, because the United States wasn't trading very much with countries that had significantly lower wages than the United States. And when it did, what happened was that places like East Asia, wages gradually came up, just as economists predicted would happen.
right.
The difficulty is when you're trading with a country like China, which manages to be a rich country and a poor country at the same time. Rich in the sense that it's phenomenally productive, and seeing huge expansion of its economy. Poor in the sense that wages are very, very low, and with 1 billion people, this whole process of embourgeoisement is going to proceed very slowly. So that has been a drag in the 21st century, and will probably continue to be one. But it didn't really emerge until the 21st century. Paul Krugman did a lot of very interesting work on this. He in the 90s, he and Robert Z. Lawrence looked at this and he said, trade is not an issue here. Then in the aughts, he went back and looked and he said, okay, now it's an issue.
Yeah, I remember that.
So those are all the things that
it's not.
That it's not. So what is it? There are two warring tribes that discuss income inequality. There's the education and technology tribe, and then there's the 1%, Wall Street tribe, and
right.
It's become kind of an ideological battle. And my answer to these tribes is you're both right. It's as they used to say on Saturday Night Live, it's a floor wax and a dessert topping. You do have a meaningful skill-based divide in this country.
Right.
It opened up most dramatically in the 1980s with the rise of the college premium. And then later you saw the advent of the graduate school premium.
Driven by technology, you think, by skill-based technical change and increasing demand for high-skilled workers?
Driven by technology in a way, not in the way that a lot of people thought in the 90s. And I think that the real contribution here is from Claudia Golden and Larry Katz in their book, The Race Between Technology and Education. And their insight was, they said, look, there's nothing special about the computer. As a technological advance, it's really, it's impressive. It's the biggest thing we got going right now, but it's not as impressive as the advent of electricity at the start of the 20th century.
Right.
So what's the real story? They say the real story is that throughout the 20th century, you saw one technological innovation after another. That was really, technological innovation is the story of the 20th century in the United States. And every time the demand grew for more skilled labor as a result of technological change, the K through 12 education system was able to produce more high school graduates, because you actually had this thing called the high school movement, which I actually didn't know about until I started research on the book. But there high schools, there was a political movement to go out and build high schools and get
Right.
states to pay for high schools and to make it mandatory to attend high school up to a certain age.
Right.
And that was a kind of conscious movement. And it was a movement that Europeans thought was very silly and sentimental. And they sort of scoffed at it. And while they were scoffing, we were getting a much more technologically advanced population. And we cleaned their clock economically because we were able to produce the skilled workers necessary. So the percentage of high school graduates in the United States rose and rose and rose until the 70s, when it dipped a little bit and then leveled off. And Golden and Katz say, that's when you saw, the demand for technologically skilled labor continued with the advent of computers, but for the first time, you weren't producing enough skilled laborers to meet the demand. And so the price of skilled labor was bid up, thereby contributing to income inequality. And I think that's persuasive. It seems to have won a great deal of acceptance. It's not the whole story. The tribe that says it's not education, it's not technology, don't tell the working man he needs to go to school. It's a very politicized, I think, stance. It's not the whole story. So, but it is, I think, a significant part of the story. Another part of the story is the decline of labor, which is such an obvious story that I scarcely need to recite it. We saw union density up at about 40% in the 1950s at the peak of the labor movement. Now we're back down in the private sector to 7%, which is where it was when Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in 1932. And a sentence I write in the book, and was tempted to write several places in the book, was, "It's as if the New Deal never happened." Workers when
you mean as far as as far as collective bargaining and labor relations and so on, it's as if the New Deal never happened.
Yeah, the level of union. I mean, the New Deal was a huge force for increasing the number of for increasing collective bargaining. You saw a huge advance in unionization during the New Deal, largely because of the Wagner Act in 1934, I think it was. It had a huge impact.
But I'm trying to ask you, though, Tim, whether or not it's necessarily a bad thing in 2012 that we have a much less unionized workforce, whereas it would have been a very bad thing in 1936 or 1945 that we had a 7% unionization rate. In other words, what I'm trying to ask about is, put it most sharply, so what? At mid-20th century, a very powerful organized labor sector bargaining with a burgeoning industrial sector was a way to get a good division of the pie between the workers and the people supplying capital. But it's not at all clear to me that that would be a sensible way to proceed in the early 21st century. What with globalization, what with the transformation of the economic relations that we've seen in the last 70 years. So, again, so what?
Well, first of all, employers haven't gotten any nicer, and the workers didn't come to be treated better in the 20th century because employers decided to get paternalistic. It was because they had unions demanding rights for their members. So I think just it's a simple question of human nature that workers are not going to give. That bosses aren't going to give employees any more than they absolutely have to. Yes. So
I take that point. I'm saying it was a good thing that we had the strong organized labor movement that we had through the 20th century. The question I'm asking is whether or not one would want to go back to such a world in terms of the character of labor relations, even if in doing so you would buy a little bit less inequality in the bargain.
Right. Well, my answer to that would be obviously we can't go back to that world. We don't want to go back to that world.
Indeed.
It's that world included a Great Depression and World War II.
It also included excluding the blacks from the unions by and large, but Yeah.
It was exclusionary towards blacks. It was exclusionary towards women. It was a very hostile time to homosexuals. It was not especially great time to be Jewish, and there was a draft. So yes, there were many bad things in that era. I actually tend to think we should bring the draft back. But anyway, the point is that there, I think, if you look at other countries have been able to preserve a labor movement even in this environment. Germany being a great example. It is not written in stone that the United States has to do without a labor movement. This is in part a conscious choice that was made by the United States government, starting with the 1947 Taft-Hartley law. For some of the book, I talk about the difficulties of just the practical difficulties in organizing today that are largely the result of legal barriers. It's not because people don't want to belong to unions. Now, obviously, unions would have to find new ways to coexist with industry. They would have to accommodate themselves to global realities. Unions would probably have to be less adversarial than they were in the old days. But it's part of the story. If you look back on the story of the rise of labor, part of the book talks about a kind of sort of little mini biography of Walter Reuther in there, and Reuther, it's a very poignant story because he was constantly pushing industry to allow a collaborative relationship with labor. And he, for example, after World War II, he said, look, we will show some wage restraint if you won't raise the price. He said this to General Motors, if you won't raise the price of cars, because we need to worry about post-war inflation. And he was essentially told, yeah, that's a really good idea, but you know what, Walter? Since it's your idea, we're not going to do it. And that is the spirit of adversarial labor management relations that prevailed in the United States, largely because that was the choice of industry, and it was a big mistake. So in rebuilding the labor movement, we would need to find a different path, a less adversarial path, more cooperative path, and industry would have to accommodate itself to that. I don't know how accommodating it would be, but that would have to be part of the bargain.
So this is, I guess we're now getting into the area of what do you think can be done about these problems, and one would be a revivified labor movement built on a different foundation of in a relationship between owners and workers.
And let me just sort of add one point, which is I was discussing this with an economic writer a couple of weeks ago, and he said, Tim, the problem is that the culture, labor culture in the United States is just so adversarial. And I said, we're down to 7%. You can have any culture you want at this point because we're building from the ground up. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's okay. But I was hoping that you'd say something also about what you think the stakes are for dealing with we've described the facts in terms of trends over time in the U.S. in comparison to other countries. We've talked some about causes, what you think is implicated and what you think is not. But what about the implications of the fact that we are in this great divergence? How do you see it as affecting our political economy more broadly? And beyond revivifying the labor movement, what do you think can be done about it?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me just sort of add one more thing, which is because I did not recognize the other tribe, which is the 1%, the anti-1% tribe.
Oh yes, of course, indeed.
Which is very important. And probably has been more important over the last 10 years than the other trends. And I don't dedicate a lot of space in my book to this, not because I don't think it's terribly important, but because the causes are much simpler, I think. The causes are spiraling CEO pay and deregulation on Wall Street. And another reason, we probably don't need to discuss that very much here, is because there's actually not even that much disagreement about it. Even a lot of conservatives these days are shaking their fists at Wall Street and are appalled by the level of CEO pay. And in fact, when it comes to CEO pay, you get to blame it on Bill Clinton to some extent, because he, with the best of intentions, passed a law that limited CEO salaries, deductibility of CEO salaries to $1 million a year. And as Nell Minow, the corporate governance watchdog, said to me, she said, two things immediately happened. One, everybody got a raise to $1 million. And two, everybody started getting paid in stock options, which were off the books and therefore shoveled with particular abandon in the direction of CEOs. So,
but let me ask you, I'm with you on this, but I just want to know, why is it that CEO pay is such an alarming indication of the kind of corrupt, plutocratic nature of our society, but the compensation of athletes and entertainers, the amount of money that's being made by people who are launching websites or coming up with new smartphone apps or whatever, is not a source of political consternation and protest. If you make a film in Hollywood and you do a good job and the thing is popular, you make a ton of money. Right. There are a lot of rich people around here who are not CEOs, who are pulling in 8 and 9 figures a year, and I don't hear about political movements to cap their salaries.
Right. Well, I think there are two reasons for that, why there isn't much outrage. One is that there is some sense that there seems to be a closer relationship between accomplishment and reward. If I'm a film director, I can't get the board of 20th Century Fox to rig things so that I make a fortune on my next movie. It actually has to sell tickets at the box office. And it's kind of much the same way with technological innovation. And there's another reason as well, which is that it is a phenomenon, and there's a winner-take-all phenomenon which applies to the arts and entertainment, where if you're Yo-Yo Ma, you have a worldwide audience. Whereas Pablo Casals, well, he had a worldwide audience too, but less of